Recording started automatically.
Oh, could we get started? Is everybody joined? Yeah.
Yes, okay. I think so, Heather. Yeah. Thank you so much. Great. Take it away.
So good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar. My name is Heather Gilberts, and I'm the author of the recent report that the topic of this webinar is based on, called Catalyzing Private Capital, Financing the Future of Public Interest Media, which was published by IMS. Thanks to IMS for also hosting this webinar. So this report is the culmination of several years of work that the Center for International Media Assistance and the Center for International Private Enterprise led in Central and Eastern Europe. And over the years, we brought together dozens of experts to explore the potential for new financing approaches for independent media. This work over the years really underscored for us not only the growing level of interest in this topic, but also the growing recognition of how urgent it is to find new sources of funding for journalism. As we all know, economic independence for news media is critical to securing editorial independence and media freedom, but the failing business environment for journalism has made the media particularly vulnerable to capture by vested political and economic interests in countries around the world. And this crisis is occurring on the backs of a tsunami of information manipulation and distortion. During the last several years, we have had a chance to witness in many countries what it looks like when the audience of a country is misinformed and manipulated. Over the past 2 years in particular, it has become abundantly clear that there are no silver bullet revenue models that can save the journalism industry. Advertising revenue alone can't sustain most outlets and is sort of falling every day. Membership models are promising, but require scale, strong brand identity, and significant upfront investment. And donor funding, while essential, has fallen precipitously. So where will the new capital come from to help media businesses start, survive, and scale? Well, if we look to other sectors like affordable housing, clean energy, microfinance, impact investing has played a pivotal role in drawing in new capital to close the financing gap. But journalism has largely been left out of this equation. Media is still widely seen, and for good reason, as high risk, low return, and its value informing the public and holding power to account is often long-term and intangible. But there is a growing recognition, as we discovered as we did this work, that we need a broader, more diversified financial ecosystem to support media enterprises, especially those working in challenging markets. And that includes thinking creatively about new financial vehicles that have worked in other social good sectors. So things like revenue-based financing, blended finance, concessionary capital, impact bonds. A lot of this is detailed in the report. And how they could be meaningfully applied to the journalism sector. So that's the conversation that we want to have today. And this panel brings together some of the most thoughtful and innovative voices at the intersection of media and impact finance. So I'd like to first introduce one of the panelists, Jakub Perezinski, who is the co-author of the report, and we worked together for several years on this project. And he's the director of Key Insights and has led newsroom transformation efforts and advised on financial models to support independent journalism in several contexts. Claire Cook is the head of journalism and media viability at IMS, and she's been a global leader in helping media organizations build financial resilience by exploring new viability strategies. Akif Merchant is the director and head of Africa at Convergence Blended Finance, and he brings really deep expertise and was really critical to this project over the years in structuring blended finance and mobilizing purpose-driven capital across sectors. Insights that were incredibly relevant to explore the gap between capital and independent media. We have Paola Maraglia, who's the founder and CEO of Momentum, and she is a globally recognized expert exploring the intersection of technology, journalism, innovation, policy, and financing. And Ross Settles is a business consultant who has worked across the media development space for decades, advising news organizations on how to build viable business models. And he brings a really pragmatic, grounded view of what it takes to make a media organization investable. So this discussion is meant to be interactive and informal. We'll make time at the end for Q&A, but please feel free to use the chat to provide comments or questions at any time during the webinar. So before we turn to our panelists, I'd like to turn the floor over to Claire Cook to provide some remarks on IMS's approach to this topic.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much, Heather. And thank you all for joining again today. Yeah, it's true. international media support, we are painfully aware of the consequences of broken business models and stuttering commitments to media development aid on our long-time strategic partners. So we really wanted to make sure that the work of Heather and Jakob and all these teams for the last 2 years really kind of made its way into the public domain. We certainly need new capital, we need new actors, we need new models, and they're so urgently needed to sustain public interest media. We need to be working in new ways, we need to be understanding and articulating the value of journalism in new ways, and I think we need to be thinking about how we can create new ventures, you know, adjacent to journalism production. So we need to be thinking about the tech that goes behind that, as well as all of the different aspects of contributing to communities solving their own problems. So I think along this journey for IMS, we have felt there was a need to do some of the groundwork also, you know, over the last 2 years in terms of bolstering our understandings of where these other funding and financing mechanisms can come from, sort of parallel to the project that Heather and Jakob have run. So last December, we launched Where is the Money, which was a global perspective on forms of funding. And thanks to Ross for being one of the chapter editors there. And then at the beginning of this year, we took that into quite tangible kind of toolkit approach for media outlets by publishing the Entrepreneurial Journalism Playbook. And in there's some really deep case studies from our networks on how to actually do this in practice. So that journey brings us to kind of this report where we want to make sure that we're moving from talking, you know, and really moving that into action, because that is so urgently needed, evidence-based action. So from our side at IMS, where we are up to at the moment is we're first of all thinking about the media development community. We're one of the biggest media development organisations now, and we are working through the Media Viability Manifesto to try and join together a community that can be active around this, alongside the Global Impact Investing Network, Philia, Impact Investors, trying to understand this, trying to self-organise, trying to exchange on what the possibilities might be. We also want any grant funding that we've got to be as catalytic as possible. So how do we make or use donor funding in kind of new ways? We're really willing to do that and be risk willing kind of in that way, very exploratory. And what we found from our own networks is an appetite bubbling up from the grassroots in all of the places where we're working for trying to understand how we might be able to work with local philanthropic, but also local private capital and potentially local government or community kind of sources in new ways. And that's taking many different forms. In some cases, it's kind of IMS as an NGO working with a local business community, at the moment sort of philanthropic with philanthropic, but potentially, you know, maybe thinking about how to develop a pipeline to connect that philanthropic funding with local impact investors. Or we have to look at entirely new entry points. So obviously we see in Georgia and Hungary this kind of really quite debilitating playbook where governments are using foreign agent laws to cut off the supply of foreign donor funding. So we have to look at ways to sort of find that new financing in local contexts. In other places, it might be about, for example, in Zimbabwe or Lebanon, it might be about pooling existing grant funding in a way that can access new private investments. And then it's also, we see potentially new emerging actors in the IT space, local businesses in Slovakia, Poland, Czechoslovakia. So it's very broad, it's very exciting in some ways to see that there might be new opportunities for us to work. But certainly IMS is interested in being an enabler for this. We've felt that certainly what we've learned so far is there's a real need for new conversations, and that doesn't happen overnight. You know, the business community speaks slightly different language to the media community, and there's a lot of work to be done to make sure that people are on the same page. And then, of course, lastly, the capacity development that IMS does and the media development community does around making sure that as many media as possible can get, as far along in their maturity in terms of financing, in terms of telling the impact story, in terms of the management side, so that they could potentially develop that investment thesis. But final remark from me is just to say I was actually in Seville last week for the Financing for Development, this once in a decade gathering of the UN, by the UN, sorry, of 70 leaders. And the real story there was very, very strongly, and it's in the compromiso, this emphasis on, using your private capital. How do we do that in hybrid ways? How do we use private investors? How do we use guarantee mechanisms differently? And then also about blended finance. So there's lots of exploratory work to do. And I know that today's going to be a really interesting conversation on that journey. So thank you, Heather.
Great. Thank you, Claire. I'd like to start our discussion by turning to Akif. So Akif, given your expertise, I think it would be helpful if you could kind of like level the playing fields. What are we even talking about when we talk about private capital? Private capital can take many forms. It can include philanthropic capital and so on, but it's not really what we're talking about in this report and this project over the years. So if you could maybe just provide some remarks on what are we even talking about when we talk about private capital, and when we talk about private sector models, what does that even mean, and why should we focus on those as a way to unlock more financing?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Heather. Hopefully everyone can hear me and see me clearly. So my name is Akif Merchant. I'm a director and head of Africa Convergence Blended Finance. Heather, if I may take the liberty to broaden your question a little bit and to say we need to talk about private capital, but also draw the distinction between private capital and commercial capital. Because those also are two distinct things. So when we think about the spectrum of capital, or when I think about the spectrum of capital, I think about three distinct pillars. One is public capital, that's official development assistance, funding from the 32 OECD Development Assistance Committee members, that's the US government, the Canadian government, the French government, and others. The second pillar of capital is capital from philanthropic agencies, your Soros Foundations of the world, Shell Foundations, Rockefeller Foundations, and so on. And even within the philanthropic world, you've got program funding, and then you've got program-related investments or mission-related investments, which we can talk about a little bit later on. And then the third basket is really the true form of actual private capital, that is capital not from the philanthropic and or the public space. And when you talk about private capital, this capital, of course, is participating in transactions, is invested for a reason. And typically that reason is to earn risk-adjusted returns. So when you are looking for risk-adjusted returns, think about a spectrum of 0% all the way to risk-adjusted returns. You've got capital that spans the entire gamut. So you've got what I call impact investors. Some impact investors say, you know what, I am return first and impact second. Some say I am impact first and return second. I'm going to trade these off against each other. So slight distinction when it comes to private capital versus commercial capital. Now, even within the commercial capital spectrum, you've got impact investors, you've got institutional capital, pension funds, insurance companies, perhaps not very germane to this conversation. You've got family offices, I think very relevant to this conversation. So there's various kinds of commercial actors in the mix, and I think it's helpful for us to to think through who we think is relevant for the media sector. Now, Heather, you spoke about private sector models. Obviously, of course, we all know they are public sector balance sheets are under stress. Public sector media is not being funded to the extent we'd all like to see it being funded. At the same time, Claire, you made the remarks that business models are under threat and under change. And so we have no choice but to think about how do we actually mobilize private capital in a creative way, such that we keep these media enterprises alive, we keep them thriving, and a thriving and independent media is helpful for democracy around the world. So that's really the scene setting that I wanted to sort of talk about, and then we can dig into this further.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Akif. And I think the key distinction to make is that philanthropic capital doesn't expect a return, and private capital often does. And there are different types of returns that are expected, and some of those can be trade-off for impact, but there is still an expectation of some kind of return. So now, Paula, I'd like to turn to you because you've been exploring the potential for a blended finance fund in Brazil. And you've been working a lot with exactly what Akif was talking about. How do you bring in new and unusual actors? So could you just provide some remarks about what you think is needed to get new blended finance vehicles off the ground?
Thank you, Heather, and good morning all. It's a pleasure to be here. I think this is an urgent topic, of course, globally, but for a country like Brazil, where the media market is extremely concentrated and where we have a series of barriers to new entrants, I think this is a particularly relevant conversation. So my name is Paula Miralha. I co-founded 2 digital native media outlets in Brazil. Both of them, while co-founding both of them, I had to negotiate rounds of investments, and also we also received resources from donors. So I'm very familiar with these 2 scenarios. And currently, I'm the director of a think tank called Momentum Journalism and Tech Task Force, which deals with the relationship between journalism and tech, which is a key relationship for us to think when it comes to media sustainability or existence, I must say, and which is founded by the International Fund for Public Interest Media. As Heather said, I'm exploring the idea, like the possibility of building a blended finance fund in Brazil to fund media and technology for journalism. And what I've been learning in trying to do this, I think the first thing is the idea of having the perspective of having a more sustainable and long-term strategy to attract capital, no matter what is philanthropic or investment capital, to the media sector. And because in order to do that, we need to have a vision, we need to have a long-term plan, which is obviously hard, especially in an environment that changes a lot. Our business models are, as Akif was mentioning, as we know, it's like dramatically impacted by the changes, by many issues, but I think technology is making us rethink our business model in a very existential way. So it's very hard to build a long-term plan when you're trying to build a fund, when you have the industry changing so fast. But I think that doing that give us more agency on how to attract this capital and how to use this capital, and leave us not so vulnerable to the constant changes that we watch in philanthropy's changes of strategy. I'm sure that everyone is familiar with that, but we've been watching the changes in the strategies year after year, which leave us always behind. That's my feeling. So to have to build a fund, I think is also a way of building a long-term strategy and to give us more agency in building our own vision. My experience also is that is a way to bring different players to the conversation and not the traditional ones, the people that we usually talk about funding media. And by saying that, I'm mentioning people from different political spectrum. Obviously, I'm talking about people who are committed with democratic values, but not the usual suspects. They're always funding media. And I think this is extremely important in our current environment, especially in a country like Brazil, where we're a country that, as many others, is very polarized. So we're not only talking about politics, but we are elaborating the role of journalism when it comes to democracy in a very broad sense. It's a way for us to elaborate that if a country like Brazil is gonna go through the energetic transition that needs to go through, is with a strong media sector. If a country like Brazil is gonna have people vaccinated, is with journalism being in place. So I think it's an opportunity for us to elaborate on that, elaborate on the idea that journalism is essential to democracy. And I think to conclude this further intervention, I think that it also gives us the opportunity to talk about with the tech sector. This is a sector that is key to our industry, that we have for long seen as adjacent, but is central. is structural to us. So to think about investment that is not only investment in the media organizations, but also in the tech that will support and will shape these media organizations, I think that it broadens not only our vision, but the kind of people that we can talk to. And I think that then you have a much more richer environment and also more potential to attract investments.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Paula. And I think what you're learning as you're trying to get these models off the ground in Brazil is really useful for the sector. And one of the things, is that it's really complicated. And I'll turn to Ross in a moment just to provide some reflections on what it takes to build a capital marketplace. But first, I'd like to go to you, Jakub, because as the co-author of the report, I know that you have really deep expertise and knowledge on these issues and how they may be applied to the journalism sector. So one of the things that you've said quite a few times is that the journalism sector is just fundamentally unique. There are unique attributes of the journalism sector that make it quite different than affordable housing and a less attractive target for impact investing or other forms of venture philanthropy. So I'd like you to provide some comments on, what are the unique challenges of the media sector in terms of getting some of these solutions off the ground?
Thank you so much, Heather, and thank you to everyone who's joining today. Just sort of from my personal experience, what I can say is, I've had the pleasure of several times being part of a deal that got private capital into media, and have also advised about a dozen media on similar efforts. So the first thing that I just wanted to say is this is not an abstract, right? When we talk about private capital in media, this is not an abstract. This is something that actually happens, and it happens not just sort of in the sense that it's successful in terms of attracting capital, but it's also successful commercially in the sense of returning money to the investors, right? So it does happen, but it's rare, right? And the problem, to take a journalistic framework for this, everything has a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? And there's problem along all three of these points. So at the entry point, there are very few investable properties. Unfortunately, this is something that years of donor dependency have made worse. We're going to talk about that a bit more, I'm sure, so I'm not going to go too much into depth, but just to give you one example, a typical donor-funded media will have a ratio of journalists and editors to the rest of the organization of 70 to 30 or even 80 to 20. A commercially viable media will be 50-50 or 60-40. Right? And that matters. That's a difference. Those are people who actually run an organization and make money. On the end part, to jump over one, there is a real problem with exit opportunities. So if I'm an investor, I'm a private capital investor who wants to go into the media sector and invest for 2, 3, 5 years, how am I going to get my money back? Now, the media might be incredibly profitable and can buy me out. That's exceedingly rare. It's theoretically possible, but exceedingly rare. There's no real opportunities to IPO. It's very rare for a media to IPO. It happens, but it's very rare. There are no strategic buyers. So how are you going to exit that investment? And again, that's a feature of private capital that is different from the donor side. And then finally, I would just spend a moment on the middle part, which is, when you talk to investors, one of the things that they really love is when there are lots of similar investments, right? Mm-hmm. When this is something that is a repeat, when you see this sort of, you can benchmark deals, you can use a similar template for deals. For a lot of larger private capital investors, it's sometimes easier to do 10 deals than it is to do one specific one. Because what they want to see is they want to see a certain amount of volume, of distribution of risk, and so forth. And going hand in hand, that partnership between the donor, the philanthropic capital, and the private capital is something that's very different. They come from extremely different worlds. And to just, Claire mentioned that they speak different languages. One thing that I've run into often is you'll see somebody who's on the private capital side and who'll be like, well, we found a model that works and we're ready to invest, and we've got, we're going to fund this news media, and they do investigative. That's a bit difficult because investigative is complicated. There's political risk, but we figured out a way to manage that. And then the donor comes along and says, yeah, but we're not really satisfied with just investigative. We'd also like them to be focused on a niche audience, to be women-led, to address an elderly audience that is hard to reach with online. And I'd also like them to address 5 other problems, right? And the investor is like, why are we jumping at the deepest possible end? And there's a real sort of, that's something that can be solved, but it takes time and it takes a volume of deals to solve. So I guess that's what I would put as the final challenge.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Jakub. That dovetails really nicely with, I mean, things that Ross and I have talked about several times throughout this project on exactly the lack of exits. What are the opportunities to have exits in the media sector? And one of the things, Ross, that we spoke about was the kind of capital marketplace that exists in a lot of sectors that's fundamentally absent in the media sector. So I'd like you to spend a couple of minutes just talking about that. What we need is a fundamentally different configuration of stakeholders. It's not as simple as just, well, get some new funds off the ground and that's the end of it. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about what this kind of configuration of new stakeholders even looks like.
Yeah, I mean, just thinking about what Akif said, Paula and Jakub, there is for this to work, a lot of the examples where private capital, investment capital, commercial capital in media has worked to a certain extent are in regions that are large financial markets. So like the European Union or EU adjacent countries, North America. But the devil is really going to be in the details, and that kind of defines the complexity of the marketplace and the actors you're going to have to involve. So most of my work as a business consultant is on the Asian side of the Pacific. So I'm in California now, but mostly in Asia. And that means looking for players that are almost creative financial product designers. It's a very different mindset than the traditional media development mindset. It means looking at, it was interesting when we were working on Where is the Money, as we got toward the end of the report, I felt a need to go back and redo a lot of interviews because we talked to the leaders of organizations. But the people we really needed to talk to were the financial officers, the people who understood the need for money, the timeline, how much money they needed, when they needed it. So there is almost a financial designer, somebody who's going to act almost as someplace between a banker and almost an anthropologist. What is the financial need? And that's, I've seen Convergence's work in other sectors where they kind of come in and do that. There is also the need for legal, building a blended finance fund or building a revenue-based finance fund in Thailand has very specific legal requirements. And one of the great things about these efforts is Claire referred to it a little bit in our opening remarks. If we get this flywheel working, it will become much more local. It will have to be. So there may be global funds, but their deployment will have to be much more local. So I think there is a legal piece, there is a financial product design piece, there is the work that Jakub talked about. Not every organization is investable, which means, and I would say not only every organization, but not every market will this apply to. So there will be some markets where there is a need for continuing media development support. There is just not the sophistication to deploy. And then the other piece of this is really the government piece. You're going to need some regulatory support for doing some of this. So Paula alluded a little bit to it in her remarks. You begin to bring in other actors that you're not traditionally used to talking to, and learning what their motivations are for either supplying capital, supplying the policy framework to deploy it. But it is, I was talking to a program manager who's working on some of this, and she's very used to working with the mechanics of the journalism and the staffing and the membership, and how do I find this? And a little bit of it is just looking up. We spend so much time in media development in the granular work of getting a story out at the kind of not to be kind of packaging the product and getting it out. And this is it's much more ecosystem work. So it's going to mean more product design, which is a type of skill set, more legal support, more government regulatory impact, and then just interacting with all of these sources of capital that Akif referred to up front. The number of times I've been in a market where I say, have you spoken to XYZ dental association? They have money for community projects. Oh, no, we don't even know who they are. How did you know? But their signs are everywhere. So it is a little bit of looking at the entire ecosystem for sources of capital, design support, regulatory support, legal support, and then just getting as close to the nitty-gritty as possible. The devil will be in the details. Yeah.
Great. Thanks so much, Ross. Lots of interesting things we're going to dig into in a little bit more depth, particularly around what it takes to be investment ready. And, Jakob and Paula have really key insights on whether content itself is even an investable part of a media company. But before we get into what it takes for media to be kind of investable and investment ready, I'd like to start again by this idea of kind of like unlocking the private capital. Where is the magic key to unlock all of this money? And we started talking about it a little bit, but I'd like to get into a bit more detail. Some of the mechanisms that can be in place to unlock this capital. We know that investors don't want to lose all their money. They want to get their money back. So how can we set up, financial vehicles that are de-risking their money so that they don't lose it all? So how can we attract these kinds of investors, and what models, and what is the use, how can we use philanthropic or public funding as a mechanism for catalyzing that ecosystem of private capital? So Akif, I'm going to turn to you, and maybe you can share an example, because of course this is really what Convergence does, is try to figure out how to build that ecosystem, and across sectors helps determine, what is needed to unlock private capital and what other pieces need to be in place. So maybe I'll turn to you to give some examples of that.
So typically when I talk to investors, they're looking for two things. One is, do I have investable product to actually put my money into? So Paula, you mentioned you're designing a fund. That's an investable product. Investors are a little bit averse from doing single deals because of transaction costs, foreign exchange risks, idiosyncratic risks for companies, and so on and so forth. So product design is really, really critical for investors. What are we actually bringing their money into? Now, there's various different ways in which one can either reduce risk or shift risks for investors and or enhance returns for investors. Essentially, that's, we're ending up at the same end destination, which is bringing an investor into a transaction who would not otherwise be able to. So guarantees are one mechanism. They are alluded to in the report. You highlighted them, Heather, but essentially you can provide investors within a specific fund, let's say Paula's fund, with a guarantee wrap and say, look, if you put X amount of money into this fund, and if you lose, for every 30 cents on the dollar that you lose, if you lose, we will come in and we will protect you from that particular risk happening. The idea, of course, is that the risk shouldn't happen, and so the guarantee is not really called in. It's a function of perception of risk versus reality of risk. You can also use public money in Paula's fund as an example, to actually, enhance the upside for an investor. So if, let's say it's an equity fund, I can come in and I can say, you know what, I will cap my returns. And if there are returns over and above a certain threshold, they can accrue to the more commercially oriented investors in that fund that Paula is designing. It might be a private equity fund, Paula, I'm not really sure. Or you could also have a grant, separate grant TA sidecar that says, we are going to provide technical assistance to all of the investee companies. The theory of change being that these investee companies now will have much better financials, much better, ability to really grow the business, and therefore you are, if you're a private equity investor, really participating in the upside and the success of the business. or if you're a debt investor, you're reducing the risk of that business from going bust or not returning your capital. So there's a few different ways in which you can think about this. So design grants, viability gap funding, technical assistance, grants, first loss capital within a capital structure, return enhancement, and so on. And then also, Heather, you were talking earlier about impact-linked finance. So one could ostensibly provide debt capital to a range of different businesses and say, if you hit certain development metrics, certain media metrics that we care about, then instead of returning back 7%, you just give me back 5% and somebody else comes in and buys down that 2%. So there's a few different ways to think about this and unpack the different levels of risk.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Akif. Paul, I'd like to turn to you because one of the things that you noted is that traditional media donors, whether they're public or philanthropic, are reluctant to kind of embrace some of these innovative finance approaches that Akif was just mentioning. Can you talk a little bit about some of the reasons that, traditional media development donors are kind of reluctant to use money in this catalytic way?
Yes, I love that now I already have a fund that we are discussing here. This is wonderful that I will
It's now
leave
the
this
example.
webinar with a fund. Exactly. So I think also to relate to what Akif was saying, I think when discussing this, I think there are different dimensions that can either attract or make it harder for people to envisage the idea of a blended finance fund. I think when we talk to investors, the idea that you have a player such as philanthropy that would come in to mitigate risk is something that it's very attractive. So, because some of these investors, they don't even like the idea of philanthropic capital, like, okay, this will come to mitigate your risk. It's something that is very attractive. You say, okay, I haven't thought about that. This isn't something that I'm used to. But on the other way, to philanthropy, to say your role here is to mitigate risk of an investor, it is not a narrative that is very attractive. So to some philanthropies, there's a lot of resistance there. So I think that part of our effort is to rebuild our relationship, like the role of philanthropy. And I think that we are in a good moment for this because we're seeing that philanthropy is kind of tired is not a good word, but it is losing its the perspective of philanthropy, investing or donating money to journalism is becoming smaller and smaller. So it's a good moment for us to rethink this relationship. And this is maybe a new way of supporting journalists that is even more sustainable because it's not like your money, you're going to put your money in a project or content. No, you're putting money into creating a more sustainable and hopefully a model that will last longer. But I think we need to be very open about this. And it's a matter of building a different philanthropic culture. This is one thing. I think the other thing that I found very interesting is that some individual donors, they don't like the idea, or investors, they don't like the idea of investing in media personally because media is a political thing, no matter what kind of media you're talking. So there is a vulnerability there. So putting money into a fund is a way of not making it personal. It's a way of creating an intermediary that can make people sometimes more comfortable. They want to support journalists, but they don't want to invest in one specific media outlet. So I think it's also about building this possibility. One thing that I found it interesting while having these conversations is that sometimes the size of the investment is too small. So it's not worth going all the trouble of and I've been on this side, having co-founding two digital outlets. I went through a due diligence for once was super complex, extremely complex, because it adopts a pattern of a due diligence, probably of a big like a startup with a much bigger investment. Today, I can tell you it was not the case. I think that we spend a lot of time and resources and money in that due diligence. So we also need to create not because due diligence are not necessary, but we need to understand what is necessary when it comes to design and investment in our type of organizations. And finally, I think that it's super important that we establish that sustainability is key for our independence. But when you're talking about private capital, I feel that it's also necessary to create a vision that is beyond sustainability, that is also about prosperity. And although Jakob said, and I totally agree with him, it's very hard to picture just exit, and we're not talking about traditional investments. I think that it's necessary for us to talk also about prosperity, because prosperity for me is key for innovation. And I think that this is something that our industry is lacking, because it's being such so much financial pressure that we don't have any space to innovate. And I think investment is also about that. It's about creating innovative solutions that will put us in a different place, will put us not only trying to survive, but being active in growing and having a true impact.
Claire, go ahead.
Am I allowed to just come in really quickly?
Yeah. Any of you
Thank
can
you.
come in at any time.
Paula, I think I just wanted to really concur with what Paula's saying, but obviously from our side as a potential donor who is trying to be risk willing with this capital, and Ross knows this because we're literally rolling up our sleeves trying to do this at the moment. And it's really interesting how I have to put that hat on and say, I have to be accountable for this money. So just as an investor needs to see asset creation, I have to be crystal clear what asset that is being spent on. And just to say that it's mitigating risk is too intangible. So what we're looking at is sort of what tangible aspects of that process, whether it's funding a secretariat cost or whether it's to say that the measurement of me moving with that capital is the ability it has to trigger match. So it's sort of that. So there are ways around it, but as I said, there is no. It feels like there's not a huge number of blueprints on this. That every time I try and move with this, I'm kind of like, oh gosh, now how do I do it? What do I do next? So yeah, we're muddling our way through.
Bring up a really good point, Claire, that I do want to get to. About kind of the need to show impact. So if we're talking about impact investing, the model that Akif said, oh, you can buy out some of, your return for impact. Well, it's kind of, well, great. What does that look like? And actually in other sectors, companies who receive impact investing have gotten quite good at being able to show the impact of those dollars. However, in some of those sectors, it's more straightforward. If it's health and you're providing vaccinations, it's kind of straightforward how you demonstrate the impact. So I'd like to turn to just a brief discussion on this question of impact. But first, before we get to that, Jakub, I do want to turn to you to discuss about, we're thinking, when we think about investing in media, we think about content production. A media outlet produces news, and that's what we should be investing in. But that actually isn't profitable. I mean, it doesn't really matter how many ways we skin the cat. It's not really profitable. So I'd like to turn to you because I know you have thoughts about, we actually need to expand our thinking about what investing in media actually means.
Absolutely. So a situation that I surprisingly frequently found myself in is there's an outlet that goes through a crisis, whether it's been taken over by an owner who is ill-intentioned or it has to shut down for whatever reason. And then you have the newsroom and all the people who are sort of involved in that project get together. One of the first things that they mention is, okay, we're going to launch a Facebook page, a YouTube, whatever. We're also going to launch a Patreon, right? Or we're going to launch a Substack. Or we're going to use one of the other plethora of sort of subscriber-based donations. We're going to launch a GoFundMe. We're going to do something like that. Those tools have arguably, I don't know if they've delivered more money to media than sort of philanthropic donors combined, but they've certainly delivered a fair amount. In many ways, I would say a comparable amount. I don't remember a single donor who's invested in Patreon or in their local offshoots. Just today, use my home country of Poland. It's called Patronite. I'm sure there's some intellectual property issues there with the similarity of the name. But it is when the previous government took over the public radio station, that was the tool that the journalists went to launch not one but two commercially successful projects, right? Just based off that software. There is a we have a dearth of software. We've outsourced everything either to the tech platforms. Advertising is completely controlled by Google. There's still a little bit of software for media that is in the community space, but the tech side of the media equation has been criminally underinvested. And I think if we're looking for a place where private capital can come in and actually drive some innovation, that would be a really good place to start, because it is the easier end. It is the shallower end of the pool. It is more scalable. Content does not scale well, at least. You have to be a bit of a magician. There's some things you can do, but it's very, very difficult. Tech scales a lot easier. So we definitely should be looking on that side of things.
Great, thanks, Jakub. So that's not to say that no content should ever be investable. So one of the things I want to move to before we move to the Q&A is thinking about what it takes to become investment ready. So not only what we were talking about earlier about being better at tracking impact. If you're going to be asking for investors to forego some of their money for impact, you have to be pretty good at tracking what that impact looks like. But other types of things, being better at the business side of the equation. So Ross, I'd like to turn to you to discuss from your experience, what does it take to get a media outlet, one that's producing news and content, to become investment ready? Oh, and you're on mute, but you're...
Sorry about that. Getting somebody ready for investment. So let me break it into two pieces. We've talked a lot about investment as in an equity exchange. I'm going to buy so much of the asset of your company, and at some point that asset will accrue additional value, and then I'll get my money out. That's not the only way to invest in a firm, right? That's what I meant up front, that sometimes the best way to support a media company is in smaller lending, or revenue-based lending tends to be much smaller, tends to return much faster. But the first piece of this is something that Jakub alluded to, is we're often the musculature on the business side is often either never been developed or has withered over time, right? So it's very easy to create a media organization that is where the entire musculature of the business side has become Substack. And so I think, so if you're talking about getting somebody ready, the question is getting ready for what? Is it an RBF financing, which could be a couple of $1,000s to launch a new newsletter? Or is it equity financing, where, like Paula described, I've been in equity deals where the diligence is longer than the return timeline for the actual investment. 18 months of diligence for a recoverable grant that has to be recovered in 18 months is not an uncommon thing. So getting people ready is one, realizing the leadership of the organization needs to realize that these business functions are as important, and sometimes for sustainability, more important than the content functions. Two, it is knowing what you need to raise the money for, how much money, over what timeline, thinking about money almost the way you would think about content, right? You think about sources to editing to distribution, think about cash the same way. What do you need? How much do you need? When will it return? How will it return, etc.? That piece of getting that instilled in an organization is a lot of work, and quite honestly is sometimes not possible. The last thing I'd say is realizing that getting somebody ready for capital that returns, if you use the term risk-adjusted returns, right? Getting somebody ready to think like that is a lot of work, and sometimes it is not possible. And knowing when, we tend to all want to support everybody, a journalist working in South Sudan trying to tell an important story, we want to support that. And you should. It just may not be private capital. Right. There may be situations where you just have to say, this is still a grant, and go with that. And that's a different pool of money with a different set of requirements. So anyway, but it comes down to, you're talking about cash the same way, you should talk about cash the same way you talk about stories or the information you're creating.
Yeah, that's super helpful, Ross. And Akif, I'll turn to you, but just if people in the audience have questions, go ahead and raise your hand or put the questions in the chat. But Akif, I'd like to turn to you because this problem isn't, I mean, there are unique attributes, like I said earlier, of the journalism sector, but this problem of like being investment ready is not unique to the journalism sector. In fact, it exists across all of the sectors that you work on, in the impact investing world. How do companies in other sectors become investment ready? What are some of the things that they need and the tools that they need to get there?
You're muted.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm based here in Africa, and for those of you who are familiar with Africa, Heather, I know you've spent time here. You will know there are a plethora of investment readiness boot camps, accelerators, business development service organizations, and then everybody in between. And most of the companies that I come across, or a large percentage of companies I come across, their founder typically is attending 3 boot camps at one time, 4 boot camps at one time, is using the grants in the boot camp to actually pay themselves. And that's how they keep the business self-sustaining. And this has now been a business for 4 or 5 years. In every other market, that business would be shut, right? So unfortunately, in a place like Africa, you've got a lot of investment readiness boot camps and so on and so forth that are chasing, that are trying to shape companies that are, essentially not meant to potentially be in business. So the question really for all of you, I think I would ask Yaqub and others as well, is to what extent do you have the right number of and quality of Y Combinator style investment readiness organizations in the media space, such that you have funding then at the end of that accelerator program. So that, let's say IMS supports something that's an investment readiness program, but then it just tells everyone, you know what, we will then make an investment and we have the right of first refusal because we're the ones paying for all of this. So there's a few different ways to think about this. Now, most of my work is in the infrastructure sector, is in the financial services sector. Those are much easier sectors to attract private capital. It's much, much harder to attract private capital in the sector that you're working in. So I would really think about, how do you design an accelerator program or a funnel that eventually leads to some sort of funding on the other end.
Yeah. And actually, there was kind of an embedded question in there. So maybe I'll turn to Yaqub to answer, which is, to what extent are there these kinds of Y Combinators for media or accelerators and incubators that do have, that support along the journey all the way to financing?
So the answer is there aren't enough. And I think what I'm more concerned about even is it's not even that there isn't anyone who's doing the end-to-end, is that we don't have the different pieces of the puzzle. If you think about the pipeline that is needed to have a proper private capital funding mechanism for companies, it's, there's people who do seed funding, right? Whether it's the 10K or 100K or a million, seed, it's pre-money or it's very early on in the life of a company. That's great, but those are not the same people. They don't even have the same mindset or the right mindset to help that organization scale and systematize its work. The seed people will be great at, engaging with entrepreneurial people, coming up with creative ideas, pivoting, refocusing the approach and so forth. But then you need to pass that baton along as the company matures. And I think that's one of the things that I find the most concerning about the media ecosystem, is that we have a lot of people who want to help get the ball rolling, which is great. Usually it requires the least capital, but then nobody is scaling. Nobody is scaling successful companies. And in fact, in the donor space, it's almost heresy to say that, oh, there's a media organization that is doing well, so let's give them more money so that they can do even better, right? It's always, oh, they're doing well, let's take away all their cash. Right? Let's make sure they don't have any and we can redistribute that to somebody else. So I think what's really critical for me is that there is nobody who's helping these media scale. And I have to say, from personal experience, I have found it easier to go outside of the media sector and then spend a lot of time explaining to people why they shouldn't be terrified about media than finding that analog in the media space. But again, this is very anecdotal.
Clarice, you have a couple of questions in the chat, but I might hand the floor over to you because I have to drop a few minutes early to facilitate the end of the Q&A. But I'll just take moderator's privilege before I drop off to thank Akif, Yaku, Paula, and Ross. This has been a really interesting conversation. I wish I could keep going for longer. But thank you very much for participating and for your really critical insights into this topic. So Claire,
no, thank you. Thank you to you, Heather, for convening as well. And just to say before you run off, I'm inundated with messages about how vibrant and grateful everyone is for this discussion. So thank you indeed for bringing that together. So thanks very much. Yeah, I guess it's a final thing. I think you've touched on it actually, Akif, just to say about this notion of accelerators, mentoring. And one of my takeaways from Seville last week was actually a lot of emphasis around micro, small, medium enterprises, no matter what social enterprise, what all corners of civil society. And actually, do we need to just almost stop getting so hung up about them being media and actually start thinking about them as micro businesses and contributing to local economies, stabilizing local systems, and actually is that more of the cell that we need to go into with this headset? If you could just unmute yourself again.
Was that a question for me?
Just a reflection, yeah. Do you think that's where we need to position
I think I do agree that we need to reframe this. I think peace, justice, and strong institutions is SDG number 16. Very few deals in that particular space. There's a lot more in the economics, job creation kind of sphere. And, ostensibly what you're saying is these are businesses, enterprises that create jobs and strengthen their local community. So I do think that there is a reframing that has to happen. But at the bottom line still is that if you don't have viable enterprises, you will not attract private capital. And if you don't have viable enterprises, you won't get structures that can pull in money into the underlying viable enterprises. So we got to work on the enterprise level. We got to work on the structuring level. We got to work on the ecosystem level. And we got to work with the right set of funders as well. Not every single funder that Claire, you must have come across in Sevilla last week is right for this particular conversation. This conversation, in my mind, should be had between impact investors, family offices, program-related investment operations of various different foundations. So it's a certain subset of the commercial investor or the private investor stack that I was talking about earlier as well. So we need to be really, really targeted and focused.
Wonderful. Maybe if there's any questions from the floor, please don't hesitate. But again, there's a few comments coming in the chat. I'm not seeing any major kind of hands up, and we've got a couple of minutes left. So it's over to the panel, really. Paula, a very final remark from yourself.
I think two things that I didn't mention, I wanted to mention. I think that one, I found a challenge when it comes to media that is related to the idea of ethics. I don't see a reason of for me, we need to have a vision of building a prosperous business that is also ethical. And since advertisement has been one of the key pillars of sustainability for media, personally, for instance, I have a lot of issues with branded content, with Taboola and Outbrain. And I don't want to end this conversation about media sustainability and investment also mentioning that we need, when we were designing our visions, our business plans, I think that ethics need to be taken into account, not only viability. I think it's a point worth making. And the other point I want to make is that a healthy business are not developed overnight. So companies, they have path that is ups and downs, and we need to be able to evoke this trust when it comes to donors and investors. We cannot hope to build a viable media business in 2 years. I mean, we need to have this trust because it's a truly challenging environment, and we need to have the space to experiment, sometimes make mistakes, but have the support to thrive at the end of the day. So we needed to have like this trust as well.
Absolutely. Fail forward. Jakob, one must win.
What one must win? Sorry, in which sense?
For this, for unlocking private capital.
I think we need templates. I think we need one successful investment into, like, pick a case that can be then referred to. Fairly large, shallow end of the pool. Make sure no one drowns. Use that as a benchmark.
Wonderful. Forgive me, Keith and Ross, we'll call it there because time is out. But as I said, I'm inundated with messages of thanks for such a vibrant discussion. So hopefully there'll be space for many more conversations like this after we've all no doubt had a little bit of a rest. Thank you to all of you for joining us. We had 65 people sign up and nearly everyone turned up, which is amazing. So thank you indeed for finding time for us today. Toodle pip.
Brilliant. Thank you, Claire.
More to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much.